September 1945, Yokohama, Japan. The harbor still smelled of smoke. Burned warehouses stood beside the water like blackened skeletons, while American transport ships filled the bay beyond them, their steel hulls reflecting pale afternoon light across the ruined docks. Along the streets, civilians moved carefully between collapsed buildings carrying buckets, scraps of wood, anything that might help another week of survival. Children wore oversized uniforms cut down into makeshift coats. Many had never tasted fresh milk in years. Then, every Sunday, the trucks arrived. American soldiers unfolded small tables beside the occupation compound while Japanese families watched from a distance behind wire fencing and shattered walls. Metal containers filled with ice and cream were lifted into the sunlight. At first, nobody approached. Rumors during the war had painted Americans as monsters capable of anything. But the soldiers knelt beside the children first. And within minutes, former enemies stood silently in the ruins of a defeated empire, watching Japanese boys and girls eat ice cream beside the same men who had bombed their cities only weeks earlier. Behind those quiet Sundays was a war that had convinced millions such a moment could never exist. By the summer of 1945, the Japanese Empire was collapsing faster than many of its own citizens understood. For nearly 15 years, Imperial Japan had lived in a state of continuous war. From the invasion of Manchuria in 1931 to the vast offensives across China and the Pacific, military expansion shaped nearly every aspect of Japanese society. School children memorized patriotic slogans. Newspapers praised sacrifice above survival. Radio broadcasts described the emperor as divine and defeat as unthinkable. Inside Japan itself, civilian life had become increasingly severe as the war turned against the empire. American submarines cut supply lines across the Pacific. Oil shipments disappeared. Rice shortages spread from rural villages into major cities. Families collected scraps of fabric to repair old clothing, while school children worked in factories producing ammunition and aircraft parts. By 1944, many urban neighborhoods survived on ration systems that provided only a fraction of normal calories. Then came the bombing campaign. Beginning in late 1944, American B-29 bombers launched systematic attacks against Japanese industrial centers and cities. Tokyo, Osaka, Kobe, Yokohama, and dozens of other urban areas burned beneath incendiary raids unlike anything most civilians had ever witnessed. On the night of March 9, 1945, Operation Meeting House devastated Tokyo with firestorms that killed tens of thousands in only a few hours. Entire districts vanished beneath smoke and heat so intense that rivers filled with bodies of civilians trying to escape the flames. Yet even as destruction spread, Japanese propaganda intensified. Government officials warned civilians that American invasion troops would torture prisoners, murder families, and enslave women and children. Stories from Saipan and Okinawa circulated widely after terrified civilians committed suicide rather than surrender to advancing American forces. Many Japanese citizens genuinely believed capture by Americans meant certain death. That fear reached its peak in August 1945. On August 6th and August 9th, atomic bombs destroyed Hiroshima and Nagasaki. Days later, the Soviet Union invaded Japanese-held territory in Manchuria. For the first time in modern Japanese history, the possibility of total national annihilation became impossible to deny. Food stocks were nearly exhausted. Transportation networks barely functioned. Millions of civilians wandered through burned cities, searching for relatives who would never return. Then, on August 15th, Emperor Hirohito addressed the nation by radio. Most Japanese citizens had never heard his voice before. The announcement was indirect, formal, almost difficult to understand. But its meaning became clear quickly enough. The empire had surrendered. The war was over. And somewhere beyond the shattered coastline, American occupation forces were already preparing to enter Japan itself. For millions across the country, the question was no longer whether the Americans were coming. It was what kind of conquerors they would become once they arrived. On August 30, 1945, the first major American occupation forces landed at Atsugi Airfield southwest of Tokyo. Many soldiers expected hostility. Some expected hidden resistance or suicide attacks. Officers warned troops to remain alert at all times. The Pacific War had been one of the most brutal conflicts of the Second World War, fought across jungles, volcanic islands, and isolated beaches where surrender was rare and casualties were staggering. American servicemen carried memories of Pearl Harbor, Bataan, Iwo Jima, and Okinawa. Many had watched close friends die fighting Japanese forces that often chose death over capture. Yet the occupation began in near silence. Japanese civilians stood quietly along roads as convoys passed through ruined neighborhoods toward Tokyo. Factories sat dark beside bombed railway lines. Entire districts remained flattened by firebombing. In some areas, the smell of smoke still lingered weeks after the surrender. What shocked many American troops was not resistance, but exhaustion. The empire they had spent years fighting no longer resembled the image of an unstoppable military power. It looked hungry. General Douglas MacArthur understood the danger immediately. Japan faced the possibility of mass starvation during the winter of 1945. Agricultural production had collapsed. Merchant shipping had been destroyed. Millions of demobilized soldiers were returning home to cities already struggling to feed civilians. American occupation authorities feared that hunger, chaos, or political extremism could spread rapidly through the country if conditions worsened. Food became one of the occupation's first priorities. Emergency shipments of wheat, canned goods, powdered milk, and medical supplies entered Japanese ports under Allied supervision. School feeding programs slowly emerged in urban districts where children showed visible signs of malnutrition. Photographs from the period captured classrooms filled with thin students wearing patched uniforms, while teachers distributed bread or soup provided through occupation relief efforts. For many Japanese civilians, daily encounters with American troops produced a different kind of shock. The soldiers did not behave as wartime propaganda had predicted. Children approached cautiously at first, often hiding behind mothers or older siblings whenever military vehicles appeared. But American servicemen frequently carried candy, chewing gum, cigarettes, or canned rations. Some shared coffee with local laborers rebuilding roads near occupation compounds. Others organized baseball games with neighborhood children outside temporary barracks. None of this erased the destruction surrounding them. Tokyo remained scarred beyond recognition. Hiroshima and Nagasaki had entered a new and terrifying chapter of human history. Thousands of former prisoners of war still carried physical evidence of Japanese wartime brutality. Beneath the fragile calm of occupation, resentment and grief existed on both sides, but inside the ruins of post-war Japan, small gestures began altering perceptions faster than speeches ever could, and nowhere was that transformation more visible than during the quiet Sunday afternoons when American soldiers started gathering local children near their compounds with something almost impossible to imagine after years of war and hunger. Ice cream. In the autumn of 1945, Japanese children often saw the occupation before their parents truly understood it. Adults carried the weight of surrender differently. Many had lost homes, relatives, or entire neighborhoods during the bombing campaigns. Fathers returned slowly from military service then, silent and uncertain of what remained of the country they once fought for. Mothers stood in ration lines for hours searching for rice, sweet potatoes, or cooking oil. But children moved through the ruins with a different instinct. Curiosity survived where certainty had collapsed. At first, American soldiers frightened them. The uniforms were unfamiliar up close. The trucks were enormous. Many children had spent years hearing that Americans were savage enemies capable of unspeakable cruelty. Some expected violence simply for standing nearby. Witnesses later recalled children bowing nervously or freezing completely whenever military police passed through damaged streets. Then came the Sundays. Near several occupation compounds, servicemen began handing out small cups of ice cream to local children gathering outside fences and supply areas. To Americans, It was simple recreation food carried through military supply chains already overflowing compared to devastated Japanese cities. To many Japanese children, it felt almost unreal. Cold milk, sweet sugar, vanilla. During the final years of the war, dairy products had become extremely rare in urban Japan. Sugar shortages were severe. Refrigeration barely functioned in many districts after repeated bombings damaged electrical systems. Some younger children had never tasted ice cream at all. Photographs and memoirs from the occupation years describe cautious silence during the first gatherings. Children stared at the frozen dessert before eating it slowly, uncertain whether more would ever come again. Others smiled for the first time in months. American soldiers who had crossed the Pacific expecting hatred instead found themselves surrounded by children asking questions about baseball gloves, watches, chewing gum, and cameras. The war had ended officially with signatures aboard the USS Missouri, but for many Japanese children, peace became believable only when the enemy handed them something made not for survival, but simply for happiness, and the soldiers distributing those treats carried scars of the Pacific War that few civilians around them could fully understand. Many of the American servicemen stationed in occupied Japan during late 1945 were barely older than the children gathering outside their compounds. Some had fought through the Philippines. Others came from Okinawa, Guam, Saipan, or Iwo Jima, where combat against Japanese forces had reached levels of brutality almost unmatched in the Second World War. They had seen kamikaze attacks tear through naval fleets. They had crossed battlefields littered with burned tanks, shattered bunkers, and bodies left beneath tropical heat. Hatred had become normal during the Pacific Campaign. American propaganda often portrayed Japanese soldiers as fanatics incapable of surrender. Newspapers printed stories of executions, prison camp abuse, and mass civilian suicides during island battles. By 1945, many servicemen arriving in Japan expected occupation duty to become another phase of the same conflict. Instead, they found children searching through rubble for firewood. Letters home from occupation troops frequently described surprise at the condition of Japanese cities. Entire neighborhoods resembled moonscapes of ash and twisted steel. Civilians wore repaired military uniforms because normal clothing no longer existed. Some soldiers admitted the destruction unsettled them more than combat itself, because the silence after surrender felt unnatural, compared to the violence they had spent years preparing for. Not every serviceman reacted with sympathy. Resentment remained powerful, especially among troops who had lost friends during the island campaigns. But many younger soldiers responded differently once occupation life settled into routine. The children surrounding the compounds did not resemble the enemy they imagined during combat briefings. They looked hungry, curious, and exhausted. Small gestures became common. Troops shared rations. Medics treated civilian illnesses. Mechanics repaired bicycles for local families. Baseball games appeared in vacant lots beside burned factories. And on Sundays, some soldiers used surplus ingredients and military refrigeration equipment to prepare ice cream for neighborhood children gathering near the bases. The effect reached beyond simple kindness. Japanese civilians watched closely as American troops interacted with children. Every calm conversation contradicted years of wartime fear. Every shared dessert weakened the image of Americans as merciless occupiers. Without speeches or political announcements, ordinary soldiers were helping reshape the psychological landscape of defeated Japan. And for civilians who had spent years preparing for annihilation at American hands, the realization was deeply disorienting. For years, Imperial Japan had prepared its civilians for a final national struggle that many leaders believed would end in mass death rather than surrender. Government ministries distributed manuals warning citizens about American troops. Newspapers described Allied soldiers as barbaric invaders driven by revenge. School teachers instructed children to resist occupation at all costs. In some regions, civilians trained with bamboo spears for a possible homeland invasion that military planners expected would become catastrophic. The fear was not abstract. During the Battle of Okinawa in 1945, Japanese propaganda contributed directly to civilian suicides as terrified families jumped from cliffs or used grenade rather than risk capture by advancing American forces. Survivors later recalled believing torture or murder awaited them if they surrendered. Those memories spread throughout Japan during the war's final months. So, when occupation troops entered the mainland peacefully after August 1945, many civilians struggled to reconcile reality with everything they had been taught. At first, people observed from a distance. Women watched American patrols from shattered apartment windows. Elderly men stood silently beside damaged shops as military convoys passed through the streets. Children often hid whenever jeeps approached. Some civilians bowed automatically from fear rather than respect. Others avoided eye contact completely. Then the routines of occupation slowly undermined the old narrative. American soldiers purchased goods at local markets. Engineers helped restore roads and ports. Medical units distributed supplies after disease outbreaks. And every week, scenes repeated themselves near occupation compounds. Children receiving candy, milk, or ice cream from smiling servicemen who only months earlier had been bombing Japanese cities. From the sky, the contradiction was enormous. Many Japanese adults later admitted that these ordinary interactions shattered wartime propaganda more effectively than official surrender announcements. The occupiers behaved not as conquerors seeking revenge, but as administrators trying to stabilize a starving country. Fear did not disappear overnight, but it weakened visibly once civilians realized the Americans were not carrying out the horrors they had imagined. For former soldiers and prisoners of war watching from the edges of these gatherings, the emotional impact could be even stronger. Some had spent years believing Americans viewed all Japanese people as less than human, yet they now saw occupation troops kneeling beside children, wiping melted ice cream from their faces, laughing through translators, and sharing photographs of families back home. The war had taught both nations to see each other through caricatures of hatred. The occupation forced them to confront something far more complicated. Behind many of these seemingly small gestures stood a larger American strategy taking shape. Under the Allied occupation, General MacArthur and occupation planners understood that military victory alone would not secure post-war Japan. The country remained economically devastated, politically unstable, and psychologically shattered. Millions of civilians faced hunger as winter approached. Communist movements were expanding across parts of Asia and Europe after the war. Washington feared that desperation inside Japan could produce unrest, radicalization, or social collapse if conditions continued deteriorating. Stability became as important as punishment. Occupation authorities dissolved the Imperial Japanese military, restricted ultranationalist organizations, and began rewriting major parts of the political system. But alongside these sweeping reforms came an equally important effort to reshape daily life. Schools reopened under revised curricula. Local governments resumed civilian administration. Food imports arrived through Allied-controlled supply routes. Public health campaigns targeted malnutrition and disease spreading through crowded urban districts. American troops themselves became part of that strategy whether they realized it or not. Every peaceful interaction between soldiers and civilians reinforced the occupation's broader message. The war was over, and reconstruction would replace destruction. Military commanders often encouraged troops to behave respectfully toward local populations, especially children. The image of disciplined soldiers helping feed civilians served both humanitarian and political purposes. In that environment, something as simple as ice cream carried symbolic power far beyond its ingredients. It represented abundance in a country defined by scarcity, refrigeration in a nation still surrounded by burned buildings and ration cards, safety in places where children had spent years hiding from air raids. Most importantly, it represented predictability. Every Sunday, the trucks returned. Every Sunday, the children gathered again. The routine mattered. After years of sirens, bombings, evacuations, and uncertainty, Those small gatherings created one of the first stable rituals many families had experienced since before the war. Parents who initially watched from a distance slowly allowed children to approach more confidently. Conversations expanded. Translators appeared more frequently. In some neighborhoods, Japanese civilians even began assisting with distribution. The transformation remained fragile. Memories of war did not disappear beneath sweet desserts and polite smiles, but in the ruins of post-war Japan. Psychological surrender had finally begun catching up with military defeat. And note where was that shift more visible than during the afternoons when silence gave way to the sound almost nobody expected to hear between former enemies. Children laughing openly beside American soldiers. By October 1945, the Sunday gatherings had become familiar enough that children began arriving before the trucks themselves. In neighborhoods near occupation compounds around Yokohama and Tokyo, small groups waited along damaged roads carrying metal cups, worn bowls, or whatever containers families could still salvage from the war. Some stood barefoot on cracked pavement beside buildings that no longer had roofs. Others wore school uniforms patched so many times the original fabric barely remained visible. The Americans noticed the same children returning each week. At first, military police monitored the gatherings cautiously. Large crowds near supply vehicles always carried risk inside occupied territory, but the atmosphere slowly changed. Children no longer froze when soldiers approached. Younger boys attempted broken English phrases learned from listening outside the compounds. Girls bowed shyly before accepting food. Translators moved between the groups explaining simple instructions while parents watched from farther back, still uncertain how much trust the occupation deserved. Then came the moment many witnesses remembered years later. One Sunday afternoon, an American serviceman crouched beside a young Japanese girl struggling to eat melting ice cream with a damaged wooden spoon. According to several occupation memoirs describing similar scenes across Japan, the soldier removed his gloves, handed her a clean spoon from the supply tray, and patiently showed her how to hold the paper cup so the ice cream would not spill down her sleeves. The girl laughed, not politely, not nervously, a real laugh. People nearby turned toward the sound almost automatically because it felt unfamiliar against the backdrop of ruined streets and military vehicles. Other children began smiling openly. A few American soldiers laughed as well. For several seconds, the occupation no longer resembled a military operation imposed after one of history's most destructive wars. It looked strangely ordinary. That ordinary feeling carried enormous weight. Only weeks earlier, Japanese civilians had expected invasion, mass violence, or national collapse. Many had burned family documents before surrender because they feared persecution by Allied forces. Some military officers warned civilians never to trust Americans under any circumstances. Yet now former enemies stood together in broad daylight while children compared flavors of ice cream beside trucks painted with white Allied stars. Even Japanese POWs and demobilized soldiers watching these scenes struggled to understand them. Some had spent years isolated inside military structures where hatred toward the United States was treated as absolute truth. Others returned from battlefields expecting humiliation under occupation. Instead, they found American soldiers organizing baseball games, distributing surplus rations, and speaking gently to neighborhood children. The contrast was psychologically overwhelming for many civilians. This became the first moment they realized the occupation would not follow the script imperial propaganda had promised. The Americans possessed overwhelming power. Their ships controlled the harbors. Their aircraft dominated the skies. Their troops occupied the cities. Yet they were using part of that power to feed children in neighborhoods their own bombing campaign had devastated. And as more families gathered each Sunday, the invisible barrier between conqueror and conquered slowly began to weaken. As autumn turned toward winter in 1945, the gatherings around occupation compounds became something larger than simple food distribution. Children, who once approached cautiously, now ran toward the trucks when they appeared. American servicemen learned names. Translators joked with local families. Some soldiers carried photographs of wives or younger siblings back home and showed them to curious Japanese children who crowded around the folding tables. In return, civilians sometimes offered handmade paper toys, carved trinkets, or carefully folded letters thanking the troops for food assistance. For all the Japanese observers, the emotional impact could be startling. Many adults had spent years mobilized for total war. They remembered speeches promising national sacrifice until death. They remembered air raid sirens, military funerals, and endless reports describing Americans as ruthless enemies incapable of compassion. Yet every Sunday presented visible evidence contradicting that worldview. Former Japanese officers occasionally watched from nearby streets without speaking. Some had commanded soldiers in China, the Philippines, or the Pacific Islands only months earlier. Others returned home after surviving prison camps or chaotic evacuations from collapsing battlefronts. Defeat itself was already difficult to process, but the behavior of the occupiers complicated matters even further. The Americans were victorious beyond question. Tokyo, under occupation, the imperial military had been dismantled. The emperor himself publicly renounced a divine status in early 1946. By every traditional measure of war, Japan had suffered complete defeat. Yet the conquerors were not behaving as many military leaders predicted. Instead of collective punishment, occupation authorities emphasized order, reconstruction, and stability. Instead of terrorizing civilians, many troops spent free afternoons handing ice cream to children standing beside bombed streets. That contradiction slowly changed the emotional atmosphere of occupied Japan. Not everywhere. Resentment remained powerful in many communities. Black markets expanded across major cities. Thousands struggled with homelessness, grief, and trauma. Some American soldiers committed crimes during the occupation, and tensions occasionally erupted between civilians and military personnel. The scars of war remained visible in every direction, but moments of ordinary humanity still mattered precisely because the surrounding destruction was so immense. In diaries and memoirs recorded years later, Japanese civilians repeatedly described the shock of seeing American soldiers behave gently around children. Some remembered tasting chocolate or ice cream for the first time during occupation relief efforts. Others recalled realizing that the men they feared most often looked exhausted themselves, carrying photographs of families separated by oceans and war. For the United States, these interactions carried strategic importance beyond kindness alone. American officials understood that rebuilding Japan required more than military control. The occupation needed legitimacy in the eyes of ordinary civilians. Stability depended on convincing the population that surrender would bring survival rather than annihilation. Every peaceful encounter helped weaken extremist nationalism that had fueled the empire's expansion across Asia. In many ways, the psychological battle after the war became as important as the military campaign that ended it. And among the ruined neighborhoods of post-war Japan, one of the clearest victories in that battle emerged not through speeches, treaties, or propaganda broadcasts, but through a simple, weekly ritual repeated beside occupation fences and damaged streets. Children waiting patiently for ice cream from the former enemy. By the following years, those children would grow up inside a country, transforming faster than almost anyone in 1945 could have imagined. The winter of 1945 passed under conditions many Japanese civilians later described as the hardest period after the surrender. Coal shortages left homes unheated. Transportation systems barely functioned in some regions. Long food lines stretched through damaged city streets, while black market traders sold rice and vegetables at prices ordinary families could not afford. Across Tokyo, Osaka, and Yokohama, thousands lived inside partially destroyed buildings because reconstruction had only begun. Children searched bomb sites for scrap wood to burn during the cold months, yet Japan did not collapse. American occupation authorities expanded relief shipments throughout 1946 as agricultural production slowly recovered. Wheat imports increased. School lunch programs spread into more districts. Public sanitation campaigns reduced disease outbreaks that had threatened overcrowded urban areas after the war. For millions of civilians, daily survival remained difficult, but starvation on the scale many feared never fully materialized. The occupation also began reshaping Japanese society in ways visible far beyond emergency aid. Military institutions that once dominated public life disappeared rapidly. Soldiers returned home to civilian identities. Wartime slogans vanished from classrooms. Newspapers operated under new regulations, while political prisoners arrested during the imperial era were released. Women gained voting rights under constitutional reforms introduced during the occupation period. Labor unions expanded. Schools revised textbooks that previously glorified sacrifice and military expansion. For children growing up during those first post-war years, the transition could feel almost surreal. Only months earlier, many had practiced evacuation drills while cities burned beneath American bombing raids. Now they attended reopened schools, receiving powdered milk and bread through occupation-supported nutrition programs. Baseball fields appeared beside empty lots once filled with military debris. American music drifted from radios in urban neighborhoods, rebuilding around shattered infrastructure. The memory of those Sunday gatherings remained unusually powerful because they symbolized this larger transformation in miniature. Ice cream itself was not what civilians remembered most decades later. It was consistency, the trucks returning every week, the realization that predictable peace could exist again after years of chaos. Parents who initially feared occupation troops slowly began allowing children to interact freely around the compounds. In some communities, Japanese civilians and American soldiers developed cautious but genuine familiarity through repeated contact. Memoirs from both sides often described the same detail. Surprise. American servicemen were surprised by the scale of destruction and poverty they encountered after years of wartime propaganda portraying Japan as fanatically dangerous until the very end. Japanese civilians were surprised that occupation forces behaved with far more restraint than expected after the brutality of the Pacific War. That mutual shock became one of the foundations upon which the post-war relationship slowly evolved, because beneath the politics, reforms, and military occupation stood a simpler reality impossible to ignore. The war had ended not with endless revenge, but with exhausted people trying to rebuild ordinary life among the ruins. By the early 1950s, Japan was already changing at a speed few observers in 1945 thought possible. Factories reopened across major industrial centers. Rail networks returned to operation. Streets once buried beneath ash and twisted steel filled again with crowded markets, bicycles, and school children in clean uniforms. American occupation officially ended in 1952, but the relationship formed during those difficult post-war years continued shaping both nations long after Allied troops reduced their presence. The transformation carried deep historical irony. Only a few years earlier, the Pacific War had produced some of the fiercest fighting of the 20th century. Battles like Peleliu, Iwo Jima, and Okinawa left psychological scars on soldiers from both sides that never fully disappeared. American prisoners of war survived brutal captivity under the Japanese military. Japanese civilians endured firebombing campaigns and atomic destruction on a scale previously unimaginable in human history. Yet from that devastation emerged one of the most significant alliances of the modern era. Part of that change came from political strategy and Cold War realities. The United States viewed post-war Japan as a critical partner in Asia as tensions with the Soviet Union intensified. Economic reconstruction became a strategic priority. American investment, industrial reforms, and security agreements gradually helped stabilize the country. But diplomacy alone cannot fully explain how public hostility softens so quickly after such a violent conflict. Memory played a role. Japanese civilians who lived through the occupation often recalled not grand speeches or government directives, but ordinary encounters, a medic treating sick children, soldiers helping clear debris after storms, school lunches arriving in districts where food remained scarce, and again, memories surfaced of American servicemen handing ice cream, chocolate, or candy to children standing in the ruins of burned neighborhoods. For many former Japanese POWs and civilians, those moments forced a painful reassessment of wartime beliefs. The enemy they had feared for years turned out to be more complicated than propaganda allowed. That realization did not erase grief or absolve wartime actions committed by either side. Families still mourned the dead. Veterans still carried trauma from jungle battlefields and prison camps. Entire cities still bore the physical scars of incendiary raids and atomic warfare. But small acts of humanity interrupted the cycle of hatred at a critical moment. Historians studying the occupation frequently note how rapidly civilian resistance diminished compared to what Allied planners initially feared before the surrender. Part of that stability emerged because occupation forces combined authority with restraint. The Americans arrived with overwhelming military power, yet they also arrived with food shipments, reconstruction programs, and visible efforts to normalize daily life. Children became central to that process almost unintentionally. They approached first, they adapted first, and through them, many adults slowly recognized that the future unfolding around them would differ dramatically from the apocalyptic final battle wartime leaders once promised. Years later, some Japanese survivors still remembered the taste of that first ice cream after the surrender. Cold, sweet, impossible to forget, because in a country emerging from smoke, hunger, and defeat, it represented something far larger than dessert. It represented the first fragile evidence that peace might actually last. War usually leaves behind numbers, casualty reports, destroyed cities, tons of bombs dropped, ships sunk beneath the ocean, entire divisions erased from maps. Historians measure victory through documents, treaties, and battlefield outcomes because those details can be counted and verified, but memory often survives differently. Sometimes history changes direction through moments so small they barely appear in official records at all. A child standing in the ruins of Yokohama, holding a paper cup of melting ice cream. An American soldier kneeling beside someone he had been taught to hate. Parents watching silently from the edge of a shattered street, slowly realizing the occupation would not become the nightmare they feared. None of those moments erased the suffering of the Pacific War. The dead remained dead. Cities remained burned. Veterans on both sides carried memories that followed them for the rest of their lives. Yet the first years after 1945 proved something rare in modern history. Even after one of the bloodiest conflicts on Earth, hatred was not guaranteed to last forever. The children who gathered outside those occupation compounds would grow up inside a different Japan, a rebuilt Japan. And decades later, many survivors still remembered the same quiet detail from those Sundays after the surrender. Not the uniforms, not the trucks, but the unbelievable feeling of tasting something cold and sweet again while the world around them was finally becoming peaceful.